New evidence is being unearthed every day that indicates human civilization is far older than we were taught in school. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey and Gunung Padang Pyramid in Indonesia are reshaping our view of the past. The mainstream narrative is that evolution and technological advancement move forward at a steady, gradual pace. But new evidence, which we can no longer ignore, is revealing that our story is not a neat, clean narrative. It is likely that an advanced civilization of humans was wiped out by a global cataclysm 13,000 years ago, and we, as a species, essentially had to start over. As Graham Hancock would put it, we are a species with amnesia. Any new discovery that doesn't fit in with the conventional view of history is often cast aside, left out of textbooks, and met with fierce resistance from authorities. But why is there such a resistance to learning the truth about our past? This can be best explained by the wise George Orwell quote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Which means that if we were to learn about the true nature of our past, we would have a very different idea about who we are today and who we are meant to be. There is incredible value in learning about where we come from. It is foolish to think that we have all the answers today. When you look at how we are exploiting our planet for short-term profit, it is clear that in many ways we are not superior to our ancient ancestors. So today's video is another brilliant showcase from Gaia, the world's largest conscious media network. The episode we are about to present is from the original Gaia series, Ancient Civilizations. We chose this episode because it takes a deep dive into the truth behind the Egyptian Sphinx, one of the world's oldest and most mysterious man-made wonders. These findings will completely change the way we see our past, present, and future.
Few symbols convey the mysteries of ancient consciousness more potently than the Great Sphinx of Giza. Just south of the Great Pyramid on the west bank of the Nile River, this mythical limestone creature has the body of a lion and the head of a human. The Sphinx is the oldest known monumental sculpture in Egypt. According to mainstream scholars, it was built by ancient Egyptians during the reign of the pharaoh Khafre between the dates 2558 and 2532 BC. But in 1992, author and independent Egyptologist John Anthony West claimed that the Great Sphinx of Giza was not carved in 2500 BC, but 9,000 to 10,000 years earlier, before Egypt was a desert, and even before the dawn of man as we know it. While studying the works of 1920s scholar Schwaller de Lubitz, John Anthony West discovered that conventional Egyptologists had overlooked an important detail. The body of the Sphinx bore distinct markings of water erosion. If it was water erosion, then the entire history of ancient man would have to be rewritten. The conversation was a controversial subject the Oxford geologist didn't want to get involved with. This did little to deter John West from wanting to solve the mystery. If the Great Sphinx of Egypt was built thousands of years earlier than was written in mainstream history, could the water erosion marks he had examined shed new light on the creation of the human race? Determined to find out, John sought other scientists willing to join his quest. His search led him to Professor Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University.
I first went to see the Sphinx in 1990, and I noticed immediately that there was a disconnect, because the weathering and erosion that I saw on the Sphinx was not compatible with Sahara desert hyper-arid conditions. What I was seeing, I was convinced, was precipitation weathering and erosion from rainfall, from water beating down on it. Now, how do you have that when it's been Sahara desert for 5,000 or more years? So immediately I saw this anomaly, and the logical conclusion I had, again, virtually immediately, was that the Sphinx must go back to an earlier climatic regime.
Can the water erosion marks that John West discovered stand alone to prove the Sphinx was constructed before 2500 BC? In 2008, geoarchaeologists Manashev and Parkhomenko argued that through their research of the analyzation of erosion on the Sphinx, they figured it actually was part of a civilization much older.
Two Ukrainian geologists believe that the Sphinx, which is on the edge of the plateau at Giza, could be as much as 800,000 years old. Why do they believe this? What they propose is that originally the Mediterranean Sea extended all the way to the plateau of Giza and lapped up against the Sphinx to create the distinctive weathering patterns that we see. I think that they could be right about the weathering, but I think that we're talking about the Sphinx before it was actually carved into what we see today. There was a rocky promontory or knoll at that site, which obviously was later used to carve the Sphinx, and that would have had weathering patterns on it. And almost certainly that does date back hundreds of thousands of years and could well have been weathered by water at some point in the past, but certainly that was not in the recent past.
As theories about how old the Sphinx is continue, Robert Schoch has found his research keeps leading him back in time. Since he first traveled to Giza in 1992, Professor Robert Schoch's research has taken his first dating of the Sphinx even further. His most recent geological and seismic findings have convinced him that the Great Sphinx could have been carved as far back as 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age.
We know geologically and from studies of ancient climatology that prior to about 3,000, what is now Sahara was much more moist, much more temperate, much more rainfall. So I concluded that had to go back at least to that earlier period. My initial estimate was 5,000 to 7,000 BC. This was very, very radical at the time. The Egyptologists were livid about this. They were saying all kinds of nasty things about me, calling me a pseudoscientist because they said this was absolutely impossible because there's no civilization when you go back to 5,000 to 7,000 BC that could construct the Sphinx. Since then, I've continued my studies. I've carried on with this. I've actually reanalyzed the seismic data, and I'm convinced at this point, for a number of technical reasons, that actually the seismic data suggests that we have to go back to at least around 10,000 BC. And this also fits much better the climatic regime and gives enough time for the erosion and weathering that we're seeing.
When could the Sphinx have been exposed to what turns out, what needs to have been about 1,000 years of very heavy rainfall? But there was no rainfall like that in Egypt in the time of the pharaohs either. The Giza Plateau was as dry 4,500 years ago as it is today. And yet here is a structure that has been heavily weathered by rainfall, which has fallen on it for a long period of time. You have to go back, more than 11,500 years. You have to go back to 12,000 years, really, to get the kind of climate conditions in that part of the Sahara that would have been capable of causing that level of erosion on the Sphinx. The rainfall erosion is most visible on the trench that surrounds the Sphinx. Nobody bothered to restore that. And there you can see this undulating profile and cuts through it. It's classic rainfall-induced weathering. And the Sphinx's body has been repaired again and again down the journey. It wasn't just in the Old Kingdom it was repaired. There were more repairs done in the New Kingdom as well. And you know, right down into more recent times, they're still restoring the core body of the Sphinx today. This alone should have alerted archaeologists to the fact that there's a problem, because some of the most extensive restorations of the Sphinx, when blocks were applied to that rock-hewn core body of the Sphinx to repair damage, some of those date from the Old Kingdom. They date from 2500 BC. Now, if you made your Sphinx in 2500 BC, what on earth are you doing restoring it massively in 2000? It should be pristine.
Greg Braden adds another layer to the dating of the Sphinx.
When we look at the mystery of the Sphinx and the Giza Plateau and the traditional dating of only 4,000 years, where that no longer makes sense is the erosion on the Sphinx has now been proven by Robert Schoch to be fluvial erosion rather than aeolian erosion. And fluvial means vast amounts of water moving quickly over long periods of time, where aeolian erosion would be wind blowing and eroding over long periods of time. Robert Schoch showed beyond any reasonable doubt that it is water erosion that has created the Sphinx. His findings were accepted by AAPG, the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. They looked at the evidence and they said, of course, this makes perfect sense. We have no problem with this. The historians have a huge problem, because the last time there were vast amounts of water moving quickly over long periods of time is when the ice melted from the last ice age, and that is now being dated in that part of Egypt between 7,000 and 9,000 years before present. So I think the evidence strongly supports that, that the Sphinx was in place when that water was melting. What it doesn't account for is the ice age was there for 20,000 years. Was the Sphinx built before the ice happened and subject to the erosion, or was the Sphinx built while the ice was in place? And we don't know the answer to that yet.
Some researchers suggest that the Sphinx could have been built during the precessional cycle, even before the current one, giving it the date of 36,000 BC.
John Anthony West's view is that actually it's not marking 12,500 years ago. It's marking the precessional cycle before that, the previous age of Leo, which would be 25,920 years before that. The age of Leo recurs every 25,920 years. So the astronomy doesn't absolutely commit us to the date of 12,500 years ago, but what does, I think, commit us to the date of 12,500 years ago is the geology, the way that the Sphinx is measured, and the fact that that was a very rainy period in Egypt. If you wind back the ancient skies to 10,500 BC, you go over to Giza and you find that two constellations are modeled on the ground there. One is the constellation of Orion, the belt stars of Orion in the positioning of the three great pyramids, and the other is the constellation of Leo with the great Sphinx gazing due east. And the strangest thing is that you again get a lock, not in 2,500 BC when Giza is supposed to have been created. None of it works then. You have to go back 12,500 years to 10,500 BC to get Leo locking perfectly with the Sphinx at dawn on the spring equinox. It's the age of Leo. It's as though the lion-bodied Sphinx is looking at its own celestial counterpart in the sky. And the constellation of Orion due south on the meridian in exactly the pattern of the three pyramids on the ground. And that only happens 12,500 years ago.
Could the Sphinx and the pyramids have been built at the same time? If so, could the ancient civilization that built it be marking a very important time for our current human race?
Now, with modern computer software, we can look at the ancient skies in any period we wish. It's interesting when we switch from geology to astronomy, and we start looking at the Sphinx and the pyramids as astronomically connected monuments. And we can't do otherwise, because the Sphinx, as I mentioned, is perfectly aligned on due east. Perfect. That's the work of people who are studying the sky.
The temple has to be a mirror image of the cosmos. In other words, you have to represent what you're actually looking at. A great example, of course, is the Sphinx. Looks at its mirror image on the horizon at the spring equinox, 10,500 BC. Boom.
Robert Schoch challenges the conventional explanation behind the Sphinx being constructed in 2500 BC.
It's been claimed that the face of the Sphinx is the face of the pharaoh Khafra or Chephren, so that would date to 2500 BC. But all of this is really very circumstantial. I think there's a very good possibility that the Sphinx was not a Sphinx originally, but it was a lion. So a lion's body with a lion's head, that the human head is a reconstruction or recarving. Maybe the head's been recarved more than once. But if you think about it as a lion, during the age of Leo, at the end of the last ice age, circa 10,000 or so BC, you had the Sphinx facing its essentially own image in the sky on the vernal equinox. And I think this was something that may have been incredibly significant.
What would be the purpose of such a marker at the Giza Plateau? Is there an unseen power that generations later tried to capture?
The idea of a lion image as an important sacred notion in a solar worshiping culture is completely understandable. First of all, the constellations in the heavens, so we're looking upward for inspiration. And the image of a lion is a very strong, courageous, noble quality. So to put the head of a pharaoh on the body of a lion is to acknowledge that the pharaoh has these great, powerful qualities. This is carved out of bedrock. Not only is the leader's energy united with the image of a lion, it is also united with the earth. So we have powerful imagery of integration going on in the great Sphinx of Giza.
Could there be a different kind of power we haven't yet been able to understand attached with the Sphinx and the Giza Plateau?
Well, it's bizarre. I mean, these are gigantic monuments, left totally uninscribed, not even the name of the supposed pharaoh. No architect's name, nothing. It doesn't have hieroglyphs, it doesn't have inscriptions. But they do speak, once you understand that the language that is being incorporated, or the designer who used the language, used mathematics and astronomy.
If the Sphinx was a powerful image, built only to reflect its magnificence from the surface of the earth to its celestial home, why would it be uninscribed? Why would the creators not explain its purpose? That answer might lie below its feet. Robert Schoch describes how his investigations led him to another significant discovery.
Below the Sphinx, I was looking for subsurface weathering features, mineralogical changes. We also found a number of anomalies. One of the anomalies, probably the most important and significant, is under the left paw of the Sphinx. And it is, for as what we can tell from the seismic, I'm quite convinced that it is a cavity, but not a natural cavity, artificial cavity or chamber under the left paw. Our initial analysis indicates that there is something in it, so it's not an empty cavity.
John Anthony West and Robert Schoch, in the very brief period that they had access to the Sphinx, they ran side-scan sonar survey all around it. And what was discovered beneath the left forepaw of the Sphinx, down at a depth of about 30 or 40 feet into the bedrock beneath the left forepaw of the Sphinx, is a very large, clearly man-made chamber. As soon as the Egyptian authorities discovered what they were really doing, they threw them off the site, and they weren't allowed to continue with their work. Do perhaps the Egyptian authorities or the Egyptian archaeologists and their colleagues in Western archaeology, do they perhaps already know? I mean, I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but there have subsequently been drilling and investigation projects under the Sphinx, which have been passed off as being to do with clearing groundwater from under the Sphinx. But I wonder if that's what they were really doing. I don't think we're being told the whole truth about what is happening at Giza.
If that might be true, could the Great Sphinx be guarding human behavior recorded for thousands or millions of years?
One thing I would anticipate finding, if there is something in those chambers beneath the Sphinx, is the records of those earlier civilizations that existed on this planet. Plato, the Greek philosopher, said that the Greek lawmaker Solon once went to Egypt, and he was speaking with one of the Egyptian high priests. And the Egyptian high priest asked about the history of the Greek people. And Solon said, in the beginning, humans were created. Then there was a big flood, a big catastrophe. And after that, they were created again. And the Egyptian priest began laughing. He explained to Solon that actually there have been many devastations in the long history of the world, and the earth has been repopulated again and again and again over the course of many millions of years. And he said, you Greeks just remember the last one, but there have been many before that. And he said to Solon, you've lost the records of these earlier histories. The Egyptian priest said, we have those records of those earlier histories.
These things that are still there underground were so vast that he was really perplexed, and he asked the Egyptian priest who was taking him around, who built these things? And their reply to him was, they were built by the crocodile kings. Now that might be a perfect definition of what the Anunnaki were, because we do see a lot of depictions of them with reptilian features and things like that. It may be at one point whoever built that chamber and hid what I believe might be the Hall of Records of the Egyptian priesthood, then chose to actually bury that up. We might find writings from them, tablets, ways of using their knowledge that they knew we wouldn't be able to get to until a certain point in our evolution where we would be able to get down to these chambers and pull out what was there.
If there really is a chamber guarding the secrets of humanity, why haven't we been allowed to have it? Graham Sear explains that the Sphinx tests the soul before it can be embodied in the great knowing.
The Sphinx, to me, represents kind of the holder of esoteric knowledge and the mystery of existence. It's sort of the watcher at the gates to heaven who tests the soul on their merit before they're able to re-enter the garden. It's sort of like the cherubim who, with the flaming swords, guard the entrance to Eden to make sure that the soul is pure enough to re-enter. So that's one aspect of the Sphinx. To me, it also kind of represents the integration of angelic natures with human natures.
If the Sphinx does mark the gateway to secret knowledge about our planet, left by an ancient high civilization, then could it be that, by design, it is intended to remain dormant until modern civilization is ready to see the universe differently? Graham Hancock suggests this question is partially answered by understanding the symbolism in Egyptian artworks.
The ancient Egyptians had I think, a beautiful way of looking at human life. This was a forgiving culture. They understood human frailty. We are not perfect. We do not enter life perfect. We are going to make mistakes. And the question is, do we learn from those mistakes? What do we do with the lessons that duality has to teach us? Do we integrate those lessons into our life subsequently, or do we just ignore them and carry on as before?
Now, these sites are very controversial. All of them are, because they force historians to rethink the traditional story. When we begin to look at a cyclic model of civilization rather than the linear model that says civilization began 5,000 years ago, it opens the door to explanations to many of the things that look simply mysterious to us and make no sense at all, such as the discovery of entire cities under the surface of the ocean that we find in multiple places throughout the world.
If the great ancient knowledge in the chamber below the paw of the Sphinx is inaccessible, perhaps the same knowledge may exist in a different location, or even in a different frequency. Healer and author Sonia Grace describes a mystical encounter meeting the ancient solar deity Sekhmet during a remote vision.
When I spirit traveled to the Great Sphinx, it was back in time. My guides took me, and we arrived around 15,000 BC. We were met by Sekhmet herself. She was standing there. She's huge. She's like 20 feet tall. She's enormous. And she invited us inside and took us down, going into the earth, a long tunnel, this deep tunnel passageway. It went this way, it went that way, it went this way again, and it opened out into a huge room. And she said, this was the portal for my people. She says, my people came here long before the Egyptian gods. She said this Sphinx was a carving of a lion. It was not the dog Anubis, it was a lion. And she said it's because we come from the Leo constellation, and it was created as a site for her people, meaning X marks the spot, this is the portal. So this is where her people would literally transport to where they were from in the Leo constellation.
If the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid are just the tip of the iceberg of our understanding of humanity on this planet, could their existence be a reminder to dig deeper? But when, if ever, will this knowledge be available to all mankind?
For all its technology and all its progress and all the amazing stuff we have, we live in a very fractured, very dangerous world right now, where the whole of human achievement could be put at jeopardy by, for example, a massive nuclear war. We have the toys to do that, to bring humanity back to the Stone Age in a matter of days. And it's possible that we could do so, that we don't really know why we're here or what we're doing. We have an illusion about what it is. And that illusion is locked deep in the past. That's where it began. And we need to recover the truth about ourselves.
Could the knowledge preserved be by the clan of Osiris? Is there a link between the Egyptian gods and Enki's mission to help mankind's advancement towards a higher culture? Could that specific knowledge be below the Sphinx?
The Great Pyramid in particular contains mathematical, a sort of mathematical code. We know for sure, for example, that astronomy and mathematics were used. The question is why. It's a sort of, well, it's the universal language. If ever we are contacted or we contact extraterrestrials somewhere else in the cosmos, the only way we can communicate is through mathematics and astronomy. Astronomy will give them location, so GPS if you like, and mathematics will be the dialogue between us. So this monument is speaking ET, if you like. It's actually speaking a universal language. We have to come to terms with that, and we have to ask the question, is it something that developed purely earthbound, or is it a contact? The questions are legitimate today.
Maybe once we tap into a different dimension, we will be able to read the code. Some believe there are locations on the planet that open portals to another dimension of our current reality.
What we do know is in places like the Cairo Museum in Egypt, a number of artifacts have been found from sites such as Saqqara, for example, that scientists simply cannot explain.
Up next, could there have been portals on Earth where the code is revealed?
We hope you enjoyed this insightful presentation from Gaia. After-school subscribers can join Gaia and watch 2 complete seasons of Ancient Civilizations absolutely free. Just click the link in the description. But act fast. This offer is only available for a limited time.